You're watching The Verdict. Scott Pruitt and Jim Priest are our guests. They're running for the State Attorney General's office. Jim, from time to time, the Attorney General's office typically finds it a responsible step to hire an outside attorney to represent the state. How would you handle those types of decisions?
Yeah. The work that is needed to be done can't be done solely by state attorneys. There has to be outside counsel hired, and I know lots of folks get frustrated with that and they think we ought to conserve our money, but there's simply too much to be done. And they kind of fall into two major categories. There's lawyers that are hired by state and state agencies on an hourly rate basis, and then those hired on a contingent fee basis. Now, the hourly rate basis lawyers, everything's pretty known about them. They agree in writing what their hourly rate's going to be. They usually have a cap on how much they're going to do. And the Attorney General has a role in approving that, making sure that the fees aren't too high, that it's an appropriate use of outside counsel, and if it's something that the Attorney General's office can handle and has the expertise to handle, then it should. The contingent fee contracts are a little different, and I think those, there's been some criticism of the current Attorney General about how those have been handled. I think an easy way to eliminate criticism is by having a competitive bidding process and making sure that it's transparent, making sure that people know ahead of time here's what the terms of engagement are. And you don't want to hire the lawyer who's the cheapest any more than you want to write in an elevator that was built by the cheapest bidder. You want something that's done by a competent person at a good price. And that's what you want in lawyers. On the contingency fee, I would have a bidding process. I'd have an independent kind of judicial nominating committee system where people would make a recommendation from qualified candidates for the case, the contingency fee case, and we check their competency and their rate to make sure that it's competitive.
Scott?
Well, Mayor, I think that, one, it should be rare. I think that when you have an agency, an office of 150 or so employees, 60 or so, now this is being, because of budgetary issues has changed, but that's something that we ought to do all we can to keep the work of the office internal to the AG's office, because the people have put that leader in place and that office in place to affect the Oklahomans' interest. But when we do have to retain outside counsel, in every instance, in my estimation, it ought to be open and transparent and competitively bid. I actually introduced legislation when I was in the Senate. It was the Sunshine Law that actually required that process, open and competitiveness, transparency, would be in place when we hired outside counsel. And that's important because the taxpayers need to know, who are we hiring, why are we hiring them, how are they being paid, and what is their role on behalf of the state? Because you're empowering them on behalf of Oklahoma taxpayers. So it's important, I think, the process is open and competitive.
Scott, let me ask you, how can the Attorney General protect the consumers of Oklahoma?
Well, when you look at the role of the AG on consumer protection, it's a hugely important role. I mean, many years ago with the tornadoes that occurred in '99 and thereafter, we introduced legislation in Oklahoma dealing with price gouging for storm shelters. So the AG must actively and aggressively protect consumers' interest with respect to price gouging, with respect to consumer fraud. Just in Tulsa this past week, we had many instances where banks and those elderly and the most vulnerable were having their bank accounts electronically compromised and funds were being diverted. We need an AG that's aggressively going to pursue that, prosecute that vigorously, make that an important part of the office on a go-forward basis.
Jim, same question.
One thing to remember, I think, we tend to have this notion that consumers are only those who are taken advantage of by a roofing contractor. It's much broader than that. The consumers in Oklahoma are both businesses and people. And the Attorney General's office has a wide array of responsibilities and tools to combat that. So you've got the Consumer Fraud Unit that's already in place that does a good job of dealing with things like roofing contractors, the Do Not Call registry, making sure that individual consumers have an avenue of complaint and can get directed to people that can help them. There's also the Workers' Comp Fraud Unit, which I think is a way of protecting consumers. You're protecting businesses and you're protecting taxpayers to make sure the workers' comp fraud doesn't take over the system. And you've got the Medicare Fraud Unit, and they make sure that people are taken care of, our seniors who are among our most vulnerable citizens. Our seniors are taken care of, they're not scammed. I was surprised to learn that 16% of senior abuse, both financial and physical abuse, is reported. So the vast majority of senior abuse is not reported. So we've got to make sure that people know how to report consumer fraud or patient abuse And the Attorney General's office has both an educational and a prosecution responsibility on that.
Let's have about a 30-second answer from each of you on the health care legislation that Congress passed and what you feel about it.
Yeah. Washington does a lot of things that we don't like, but we can't react out of frustration and anger at things that they don't like. We have to have a cooperative constitutional relationship. And I tell my clients all the time, don't go to court unless it's a last resort. Now, I would not have sued in federal court in Florida, and I won't if I'm elected. But there is a way to go directly to the U.S. Supreme Court. I'm admitted to the U.S. Supreme Court, so I know about this, to file a petition and ask the U.S. Supreme Court to decide thumbs up or thumbs down on the constitutionality. And if I were going to do anything, that's what I would do, and spend my time fighting crime.
Scott?
I think we need to engage on the health care legislation, challenging the constitutionality of it. Either joining the other 20 states or filing an independent action, I think, is a strategic decision that should be made at the time the next Attorney General takes office. To me, it's bigger than health care. It's about power and authority. It's about the role of the federal government and what reach they have over our lives, both business and individual. It extends into other areas like the EPA. EPA has indicated they're going to regulate CO2 without cap and trade being passed. Texas has already responded aggressively to that. We as a state have to protect our interest. The consumer, the banking bill that was just passed, the financial reform package. Again, areas that traditionally have been left to the states, the feds are moving aggressively in those areas. It's about power and authority, and we've got to respond to it.
We try to wrap up these shows with two candidates, with giving each of them an opportunity to give a kind of a closing statement to the camera. We flipped a coin before the show starts. The result of that coin flip was that Scott would go first. Scott, your candidacy.
Fundamentally, I think that any candidate running for office, the most important question that they need to answer is, what's your motive? Because, you know, issues change. We can't predict 2 or 3 years from now what the issues the next Attorney General is going to be dealing with. 2 years ago, if we'd have said the federal government would have passed a health care legislation coercing everyone in America to buy health care, we'd have said, no, that's not going to happen. It did. So when someone seeks an office for a position or a title, when they get it, they do everything they can to keep it. And they don't risk and they don't lead. That's not my motive. My motive is to advance Oklahomans' freedom, the state's interest, against a Washington, D.C. mentality that they know best. And we, as myself as the Attorney General, and we as a state must respond to that in a meaningful fashion, while at the same time maintaining a commitment to those traditional roles of the office of fighting crime, handling the death penalty cases efficiently, and also making sure that we tackle and fight corruption in the state of Oklahoma.
Okay. Jim?
Well, one of the things that I want to tell our viewers is that you're making a hiring decision. I started out the program earlier saying, gentlemen and ladies of the jury, you'll vote on November the 2nd. And you are informed jurors. You'll look at the evidence, and I think there's a clear choice in the role of Attorney General and how Scott views the role and how I view the role. I think the most important job of the Attorney General is to protect the people through prevention and through prosecution. And I think we at the Attorney General's office ought to be engaged in protecting our most vulnerable citizens, making sure that our children are protected, our seniors are protected, domestic violence victims are protected. We've got to deal with the methamphetamine problem and the prescription drug problem, and the Attorney General can have a significant role in that. That's why I created the Law Enforcement Advisory Panel, to make sure that I'm listening to law enforcement people in the field. Water is a huge issue, and both the pollution and the sale of water is going to loom large on the agenda of the next Attorney General. So when you get in the voting booth, I encourage people to look at this as a hiring decision. You're hiring who you want to be the people's lawyer over the course of the next 4 years. Look at the qualifications, look at the background, get recommendations from people just as you would if you were hiring a lawyer to represent you in a car accident or in a will. The family lawyer is important to you as individuals. The Attorney General is important to you as people in the state of Oklahoma. And if you'll make that hiring decision, the most qualified candidate, I'm confident you'll vote for me, and I appreciate and be grateful for your vote.
Jim Priest and Scott Pruitt are running for Attorney General. Thank you both for coming on The Verdict. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you all for your time.
Yeah, thank you very much.